Thank you, Mackenzie, for your 5 most erotic words. Thank you so much for being in the issue and for standing there and sharing them with us. Just to say that we've had, in the last week, Horny has been pinging around Instagram because of Mackenzie, so thank you for that. Well done. I'm Lucy Rover. I'm the editor of the Erotic Review, and I'm so happy to be standing here with all of you for our launch of the 3rd issue and also our first ever literary salon. Last year we we published the first relaunched issue of the Erotic Review, reconceived for a contemporary audience to explore desire. And right from the start, the sellout launches in London and Berlin, the engagement and curiosity around writing and art that seriously considers our erotic lives have been so energizing, so enlightening, that it's kept us all going when running a literary and art journal has at times seemed completely mad. Thank you for being here, for supporting us. Thank you for spreading the word, for reading and engaging with the art. You allow us to continue with the project, and we're offering a 25% discount on annual submissions this night only for all of you. More on that later. Issue 3 is a beautiful, wild, fiction-heavy collaboration with seams of polemic and poetry running through it. We're launching in 3 cities. I was in Brussels in a curating an art space in April. We're here with you in Reference Point today. And the Berlin launch is in 2 weeks at Shakespeare & Sons. Yet what is particular and magic about tonight is that it's also our inaugural literary salon. It's conceived as a series of 3 events in May, in June, and in July that connect the ideas and desires, the art and arguments in the 3rd issue. These are conversations that we need to be having, and we believe that the uncensored and free space to explore them through performance and screenings and discussion is here. We want the work in the magazine to spring free from the pages and the intimacy of reading the printed word. The Erotic Review itself isn't thematic, but each one is a very individual character, individually designed by Studio Frith. Running through the veins of issue 3 is an element of questioning, of uncovering uncomfortable truths, of ways in which we might decolonize desire. How can we express our authentic desires and selves? How can we create space to acknowledge the legacy of trauma in our erotic lives? What are the risks and what are the gains of stepping outside heteronormative structures? I want to thank Reference Point for collaborating with us again. It's the perfect space for our salons. It feels philosophically aligned, a space where people can actively explore ideas, explore design, explore art, discuss and relax, work and learn. I'm now going to hand this over to the brilliant Saskia Vogel, my co-creator, fresh from Berlin, to introduce the evening of exploring non-monogamy. Thank you.
I'm just going to steal this one. Is it okay? Hi, everybody. I'm Saskia, and that phone is for timekeeping. We're going to talk to you for about 45 minutes, and then I hope you will have some questions at the end. So yeah, I'm the deputy editor of the Erotic Review, and I'm really happy that you've joined us tonight to celebrate the launch of our 3rd issue. I'm delighted to be here today with Laura Ramadei. Great start. Hi, everybody. A certified intimacy and relationship coach with an extensive background as a writer, educator, communications trainer, and consultant. She's also best known as host of the intersectional feminist podcast, Girls on Porn, which I love, and she works with individuals, couples, and groups with specialization in relationship and power dynamics, non-monogamy, and kink. And so welcome, Laura. And we also have here with us Lian Yao, aka Polyphilia, a British award-winning polyamory educator, writer, speaker, certified sex and relationships educator, and trainee psychosexual therapist whose work is all about non-monogamy and sex positivity. She draws from her lived experience as a polyamorous, bisexual, neurodivergent, and Asian agender femme who has been openly non-monogamous since 2016. So the springboard for our salon tonight is Laura's essay, The Ethical Slut, A Lived Experience, which looks at sort of the theory versus practice of non-monogamy via the classic guide to polyamory, The Ethical Slut, classic guide to polyamory, open relationships, and finding freedom in sex and love. It was first published in 1997, and this is an updated edition where, it kind of reminds us that things like consent or non-conforming genders, etc., are much more part of the vernacular today, which I hope we're gonna get into a little bit, the sort of what this classic text means to us across the generations. I first found The Ethical Slut like in 2004. I entered into sort of a kinky social scene in Los Angeles, and it was just this book that was there, and everybody read it, everybody felt really close to it, and I kind of wanted to read this tiny little excerpt from the book that's under the rubric, What Can You Learn? So, if thinking about all this makes you kind of nervous, what you are experiencing is how threatening it feels when the customary boundaries you take for granted and believe apply to all social and sexual situations may no longer apply in some environs. There are no universally accepted boundaries of gender or attraction among consenting adults, and the limits of sexual exploration are not handed down on stone tablets by some higher authority. I really liked that to contextualize this idea of non-monogamy, because I think tonight we're going to be exploring some questions that apply to anyone in terms of questioning norms. But just to turn it over to you guys first, Laura, when did you first encounter The Ethical Slut? How did our piece come to be? What does this book mean to you?
Yeah, I actually talk about it a little bit in the piece, and I think that is included in the excerpt. But I first came across Ethical Slut without quite knowing what it was. It's canon. It's sort of required reading for any polyamorous person. And when I first read it, I just thought it was a general sluttery guideline and not necessarily specific to non-monogamy. So it was incredibly eye-opening and groundbreaking, but also foreign and sounded at that time many years ago like a kind of logistically exhausting endeavor to consider multiple relationships, considering how difficult one can be. And then for this piece, I revisited it, and I think that came out of things that I had been thinking about at the time, but also just meeting you in Berlin and having a conversation at a wonderful dinner party that you included me in, where a woman who runs, doesn't matter.
She's the head of sex education at Other Nature, which is like a queer collective run, vegan, inclusive.
Incredible sex shop.
If you want to know anything about
fantastic
exploring,
toy selection.
Yes.
I stopped by. Yes, the Ethical Slut came up, and she shared a story about a woman just seeing it on a shelf and freezing with almost like a trauma response because a partner had kind of forced the text on her and just spoke to how polarizing it can be. And I was thinking a lot about how disruptive non-monogamy can be, and as a coach experiencing what it feels like for the partner who didn't ask for any of this. And so that's a lot of what the piece gets into. It gets into practice versus theory, how messy it can be actually to apply these things and the pressure we put on ourselves as non-monogamous people to kind of do it perfectly and to not struggle with obviously very complicated, nuanced things, and also just built-in power dynamics of being the person asking for the non-monogamy. We'll get, I'm sure, more into this later, versus being the person who didn't want that and is suddenly considering this very terrifying prospect. And also just the general power dynamics of our culture of what do the finances and resources look like in a marriage, and what does it look like if you have one arrangement and then want to shift that arrangement, all of these considerations. And then I also talk about just being a public slut and also being an intimacy coach in the way that I am often perceived based on my like public persona versus how I operate in session. So yeah, we just kind of got to talking about all of that. And
I think just like an insight on the, I guess, commissioning process around the erotic review, like this conversation was really exciting to me because the Ethical Slut was presented as like the Marmite of books in the sex space. Like you either love it or you hate it. And that Kitty from Mother Nature was like, yeah, it's like the most polarizing book on our shelf because exactly of what you described. And we were in this context of a lot of people who worked with like body and somatics. And I felt like it was one of those things where like the room was energized and it felt like magic that you were there to sort of bring it all together. And of course I was a fan of the podcast. Well, and then of course this conversation expanded and we want to like expand on the piece and bring Leanne into it because Laura is a huge fan of your work and was like, we must speak with Leanne because of this question of generations. Right? Like, how is this text like moving through the decades? And so I was kind of wondering in a similar way, like how did the Ethical Slut arrive in your life, and in terms of your work, like how does it connect or how does it feature? Is it a Marmite text for the people that you interface with as well?
Yeah, so The Ethical Slut was a book that I came across when I was already practicing non-monogamy. I had quite an unusual journey into it. Like I think for a lot of people, like their journey into it is like they were in a monogamous relationship. They either like read an article or meet a friend or whatever, like who is polyamorous or non-monogamous, and they're like, oh, that's something I can do, and then they start thinking about it. Whereas for me, I was like, I had one monogamous relationship when I was like 16, it was fine, and then my second relationship was open. And it was like a very organic conversation between us. Because at the time we were going long distance and I was just like, well, there's some things that we can't do if we're going to be like long distance, and it just kind of makes sense. And so like at 17, like that was just kind of what we were doing. And so yeah, I came across the Ethical Slut, I think probably like maybe 3 years after that, and you know that relationship ended because of course your first open relationship is likely to be a train wreck. And yeah, I mean I think the book is fine, you know, like I think I think I agree that it's canon. I agree that a lot of people you know, like it's probably like their first book that they come across like about non-monogamy, although I do think that Polysecure is probably replacing that now, like I know since it came out a couple of years back.
Can you tell us a little bit about Polysecure?
Yeah, I mean, basically, Polysecure is just it's a book about the intersection between like non-monogamy and attachment theory. It's written by a therapist. It kind of talks about like how to navigate non-monogamy no matter what attachment style you have, and it's very inclusive. It doesn't try to pressure you towards a secure attachment style like a lot of books around attachment theory do. And so yeah, like and it's quite like thorough in that way as well. And it's less of a manifesto compared to Ethical Slut. But in my dating profiles, like for a really long time, like the first line of my dating app bio was it was something along the lines of like I'm not I feel the Ethical Slut should be called the honest hoe. Yeah, like just because like it's just kind of the kind of thing where like if you get it, you get it. But yeah, I mean, I think that The Ethical Slut was, you know, a book that I enjoyed at the time, and you know, we're gonna get into it, right? Because like your piece talks about like the audience for which the book is meant for.
I talk in the piece about how it is a text for the recent convert and not the wary disbeliever. Like you are already in the church if you are reading Ethical Slut and you're digging it.
Yeah,
whereas it can be quite abrasive if you're not.
Yes.
Because a lot of it is presumed and yeah, I talk more about this in the piece that like it doesn't do much for the like. There's not a lot of coverage for the person who's been kind of accosted by this possibility.
The reluctant polyamorous.
Yeah. The polyamorous under duress. Yeah.
More book titles, please. So, I mean, one of the things that I love about your piece and that we're going to hear in the reading that I'll bring the actors on for in just a second, because Laura was so kind and organized like a proper bringing this performance to life, and we're so grateful that you're here. But just to tee it up a little bit, one of the things that I really loved discussing with you as we were working on the piece was this idea of like the purity of theory. And just thinking back about like what an aha moment a text like this was. Like I was, God, everybody's like a lapsed Catholic in my family, heteronormative, family structure, whatever, Southern California, suburban, and like to find this text like alongside a community and to kind of have the sense of like, or like a sort of community of people that were sort of, at the time quite on the fringes of sexual exploration in Los Angeles. It was that like aha moment of like, oh, I like, it's possible, and there was like an opening. And I think that opening, I guess it's, you're already part of the church if you're finding it, and it's so nice sometimes to have a language for things. But I think what we're going to hear from Laura, Evan Enderle, and Susanna Hislop is a kind of, we'll get a taste not only of Laura's essay, but also of, kind of exactly this, like preaching to the converted versus like, how do we hold these things if you're, how do these conversations get held when people have different starting points? So let me warmly welcome our wonderful actors to the stage.
He studied his beer, his fingers casually sliding through the perspiration of his pint glass. The attraction was still palpable, even after so much time apart. The forbidden crush that we'd shared for many years had oddly never felt particularly dangerous. There was usually an ease in the way we flirted, I think because we both knew that neither of us would let anything happen. But tonight he'd asked me for drinks and forebodingly a talk. We hadn't seen each other in at least a year, and the last time we'd crossed paths was a happy accident. A quick scan of his social media and had revealed dozens of photos of tiny fingers and tiny toes, wide, exhausted smiles as he and his wife welcomed their first little one into their cramped NYC apartment.
I don't quite know how to say this.
I held my breath as he went on.
Let me just put it this way. Whatever you think I might have felt about you, I did. I probably still do. Whatever you suspect I was feeling or trying not to try, it was all of that and more. But I didn't treat you fairly. I kind of enjoyed the thrill of being around you. And especially at a time when my relationship wasn't in a great place. I used you in a way, and I owe you an apology for that. It wasn't fair to you.
I think the flirtation wasn't unwelcome, but I never expected or hoped that we'd do anything. I really appreciate the apology, but it isn't necessary. He took my hand, one of the more intimate gestures we'd ever shared.
Yeah, but you deserve better. You're a really incredible person.
I masturbated to the thought of him that night and then never again. We saw each other as friends in passing and through mutuals occasionally before I moved to the West Coast and he shipped his family upstate. We didn't keep in close touch. An occasional text here and there, catch-ups mostly about what a handful 2 kids can be compared to 1. I enjoyed calling him the one that got away, an honor he alone deserved. In our experience, though, it's much more common that one person wants to open the door to outside connections and the other hasn't even considered it and is appalled by the idea. The situation is definitely more difficult, especially when the third member of the triangle, the outside partner, potential or actual, open or secret, is waiting in the wings and probably cares a lot about the outcome of this process. The Ethical Slut. The first time I read The Ethical Slut almost a decade ago, it was an anthropological endeavor. The Ethical Slut was a totem of a subculture. Dossie Eaton and Janet Hardy's publication is best described by its own subtitle as A Practical Guide to Polyamory, Open Relationships, and Other Freedoms in Sex and Love. The book was groundbreaking when it was first published in 1997. The Ethical Slut defines and champions sluthood and all its virtues, offering advocacy and affirmation for both burgeoning and hardened deviance. The authors, as seasoned sluts, naturally speak from a place of advanced experience. They share modi operandi that have been finely tuned in the queer and kink communities of places like San Francisco. Subsequently, the book jumps right into the deep end. Sluts are often characterized as greedy, voracious creatures with little to no self-control, and though most of us can be held responsible for at least a portion of the mess left in our wake, the individual is often the scapegoat for the culture clash. Patriarchal systems of power pit women against each other, forcing us to fight for resources we're told we can only secure through monogamous relationship with men. And as sluts, we must also arm ourselves with harm reduction tools and exhaustive communication practices to navigate those incredibly nuanced power dynamics, personal priorities and rules for engagement, Google calendars for date nights, consent practices for the orgies. Intentional, ethical career sluts are not chaotic, but in fact, the most rigorous population I know. It's not an accident that good girl is the most delectable pair of words in the slut vernacular. And this is precisely the population that the Ethical Slut serves. The sex nerds who use rules and carefully constructed processes to prevent trauma. Sometimes when I watch videos created by TikTokers, a generation younger than me, who have been poly most of their adult lives, I can see the propaganda showing. It's necessary. We have to build networks of safety to vocally grapple with the tension between theory and practice. But we get stuck in our echo chambers and forget how terribly foreign our world is to anyone outside of it. She didn't take her husband's name, so when she appeared in my inbox, I set up a consultation and went in cold. With her mic on, but her camera still dark, I could hear the playful shrieks of children in the background. She quieted them gently with the measured tone of a very good mother.
I'm going to be on a call in here, so I need privacy.
When she turned her camera on, her hair was piled on top of her head with a scrunchie, wiry grays staging a rebellion against the smoother texture of the rest.
Do you have kids?
I shook my head. The question was the first test I'd fail. Quite often with women who are potential clients, they'll Google me and see I host a porn podcast. I'm a career slut, I post thirst traps and evangelize the allure of non-monogamy publicly, which makes me the other woman incarnate. They don't know that the majority of my work is advocacy. Her face was instantly familiar, but a few passing photos on Instagram years prior weren't enough to place her. It wasn't until I asked how she found my services that I connected the dots. A recommendation from a mutual friend had prompted her to reach out. And I was thrust into the thick of an unfolding ethical conundrum. I couldn't tell her how I knew her, as it would immediately destroy any sense of safety in the moment. And even though I'd put aside feelings for him years prior, the obvious conflict of interest meant I couldn't work with her.
I guess I'm here to talk about my marriage. It's a good marriage. I mean, I thought it was. But he's asked to try ethical non-monogamy.
Her tone was laced with a subtle groan, like her husband was begging her to try something utterly childish.
He says he hasn't done anything yet, but he also says he thinks it's who he is. I don't know if that's bullshit. It feels like bullshit. I know it's all the rage right now, but I just didn't think that's who we were.
How did it land on you when he asked to open things up? Did it feel like a betrayal, or was there any hint of excitement for you two? I could see she was at a simmer, an apparent blend of embarrassment and frustration.
I'm just not sure that he doesn't have someone waiting in the wings.
Do you believe him when he tells you he hasn't pursued anyone else yet?
I'm tempted to go through his phone to make sure. It's not very non-monogamous of me. He says nothing has ever got him further than a crush, but that somehow he knows it's in the fabric of his being that he wants multiple lovers.
There was that thickly laced tone again. Uncomfortable, she shifted and bumped her desk so that her Zoom screen shook violently as if she was inside her own private earthquake.
Everything he's ever told me feels undone now. That I'm the most important thing to him, how special I am, that I gave him everything he ever wanted.
I imagine this is all very hard to process. Wonderful things might await her on the other side of this abrupt request from her husband. New sexual adventures, profound love reaffirmed, and the candid conversations reevaluating their relationship. But change, whether cultural or personal, often brings destruction before we can rebuild.
I can understand it, in a way. I just can't see a world where I don't just end up at home with the kids while he's out having fun. It feels like my back is against the wall.
When I picked up the Ethical Slut again more recently, this time the expanded 3rd edition, I was returning as a veteran, a survivor and champion of all the complicated, wonderful, emotional mess of life choices that can be incredibly challenging and potently disruptive. And though the text beautifully condenses an overwhelming landscape into an incredibly handy manual, it's hard to write a practical guidebook that effectively speaks to an outsider, especially while that outsider is likely navigating one of the most challenging upheavals of their emotional life.
And we're back. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. Love that. I wanted to pick up on this idea of theory and practice. I guess also in terms of what, like, the idea of, you framed it as like a sort of archetype of slut, or being a public slut, as you write, represents in kind of a traditional monogamous framework, like the figure of the slut in this ethical slut context presents. And I don't know, I mean, I really, we really feel for the wife in this piece. She's, I think those concerns about, like, exactly him going out and having his fun while she stays at home with the kids, and kind of, it also speaks to this idea of, like, having a really hard time seeing outside of kind of the normative structure that she's based her life around. And I was kind of wondering if you could speak to that, but both of you actually, about, I guess, the reproduction of norms in these relationships. And, I don't know, this transition, such a moment of transition.
Should I start?
Go for it.
So I also do, coaching, peer support kind of thing with, individuals, couples, groups, whatever. And I come across this situation a lot. Like, there is typically one person who's much more enthusiastic than the other. And the thing is, like, it's a difficult position for both parties, because the person who is more, like, reluctant is kind of feeling like they're being, like, dragged along. Whereas, the other person who kind of wants to go ahead feels like they're being held back. And so it kind of becomes like, like just two opposing forces, and it obviously leads to a lot of potential conflicts. And I guess, like, I do want to say, though, that, like, even, like, I have seen this situation develop in, like, all kinds of directions. Like, sometimes the person who's more reluctant stays reluctant, and sometimes, like, they end up making a compromise, or they end up leaving the relationship. But also, I've seen situations where, like, the person who was more reluctant ends up actually flourishing in non-monogamy, even more so than the partner who was initially really excited, and then the other person starts getting scared. So, it really flips, and it's really hard to tell sometimes, like, when you meet someone who is, like, trying non-monogamy for the first time, whether they're going to struggle with it or not long term, because we have to unlearn so much, heteronormativity, mononormativity, etc. Like, and obviously, you've spoken about change as well in the piece, and how navigating change, no matter what kind of change, like, is really challenging. So, like, whenever I have clients come, I don't know if you have this experience, but whenever I have clients come to me and they're like, I don't know, like 2 weeks into it, and they're like, I feel like I'm drowning, I don't know whether I'm cut out for this. Like, do you think I'm cut out for this? And I'll often be like, I think at least the first 6 months, it's really like, I don't think that you can answer that question. I don't think you should answer that question. Because you have to navigate through all the unlearning and the kind of the change kind of settle in, and how to be the new normal before you can figure out like, okay, is this something I actually want? And of course, if you don't want it and you don't want to give it a go, then obviously you're entitled to not do that. But yeah, like for like someone who is kind of trapped in a situation where there's like marriage and kids involved, it can obviously get a lot more complex. What do you think?
Yeah, I see a similar thing quite often of like, am I a person for this, or like wanting to latch on to the identity before even knowing what's in store and how capable you are of navigating it. And it can be really hard, I think, for people to parse where their desire actually resides, like we talk about polyamory under duress a lot in our work, that like if you're not the person who asked for it, there's inherently a sort of imbalanced power dynamic because you want to hold the relationship together, most likely. And when you're in that position, it feels like you've been given an ultimatum, even if it isn't presented that way necessarily.
Get with the program or it's over.
Yeah, it's this or you don't get to be with me. So it's like, okay, I'm going to negotiate what feels probably to that person like a half relationship or like less of it, but it's a process of seeing what that feels like and opening up to it, and actually like seizing on what can be beneficial for you, which is like that little section in the reading of what I really try to lean into with clients is like, however you proceed, we must do foundational work on the relationship first and make sure that like if there are grievances that we're addressing those and we're not like testing the foundation of something that might be shaky with one of the most complicated things to introduce to a relationship, right? So it can be an opportunity for people to actually like communicate about things that are taken for granted in many monogamous relationships, and to like unearth all of that, to like look under the hood. And I'll add too, like the piece is fictional for the most part. It is largely inspired by a combination of real events. I think the closest verbatim is the scene with the husband, but his wife never approached me for services. She is a combination of many different people in my life, prospective clients who have been wary of me for exactly that reason, who did not work with me, metamors, and even a very close friend who was endeavoring polyamory and had exactly that narrative in her mind, a very leftist, progressive person who in theory was like, I see why this works. Like I have friends who are in like fully functional anarchic polycules, but I have 2 kids and I have an ex-partner who does not show up for those kids, and I have a new partner coming in saying that they want polyamory, and I have a very hard time like trusting that I won't just be the primary parent and therefore like a landing pad and the totally disempowered party. So the conversation with her was like, if you're gonna do this, you need to put in place those power dynamics. Like you need to address the fact that like you have kids, and if you're gonna invite this person into your life in that kind of capacity, you need to account for that time and that person, and this is gonna take trust building, and it's not like you wanna jump right into co-parenting, but like they need to be watching the kids so you can go off and have fun as much as you are watching the kids so they can go off and have fun. And that's where like the work that we do, I think, often comes in, is that like in a vacuum, it's like a free-for-all in theory of like, I can do whatever I want because I have autonomy, and it's like, don't weaponize that autonomy, don't do that.
Yep.
There are other considerations that like have to be accounted for, and that's where the work starts before we go out and get on field and go hunting.
Yeah, like, and actually jumping on what you said about like 2 things I want to address. Like one thing is there's another book that I frequently recommend to my clients called The Anxious Person's Guide to Non-Monogamy. And it came out like I think 2 years ago now.
Yeah,
written by a wonderful kind of agender person called Lola Phoenix, who also runs the Non-Monogamy Help podcast. And one of the kind of main things that they set out at the beginning of the book is that no matter like what situation you're in, you need to find your anchor. And what they mean by that is you need to find a reason for doing and practicing the relationship style that you're practicing that is for you, and like not related to a partner, not related to a connection that you're wishing to keep. Like it's something that is like personally motivated, that is independent. And so that, you know, you're not hinging like everything on like maintaining a relationship with someone else and then potentially losing your own identity in the process. And the second thing I wanted to address was what you said about freedom. Like the word freedom, autonomy, like it gets bandied around a lot in non-monogamous circles, and I'm sure you've met the classic kind of like fake relationship anarchist who interprets relationship anarchy as like, I can just be fucking chaos.
Or the solo polyamorous.
Yeah,
who's like, that means I have no emotional responsibility.
Yeah,
And,
which is such a bastardization of like what solo polyamory and relationship anarchy mean. And just for the benefit of the audience, I'll define them as well. Like, so solo polyamory is a specific subset of polyamory where you are engaging in multiple committed relationships, but you're not engaging in those relationships in like traditional markers of commitment. So you may choose to like live a very independent single lifestyle. Like you might live alone, or you might not live with a romantic partner. You might never get married, kind of thing. And so like self-partnered in that sense, but also like having kind of multiple romantic connections, just not in a way that like is on that escalator. And relationship anarchy is taking a politically anarchist approach to relationships where you're not assuming commitments or assuming hierarchies and that kind of thing, and you're co-creating connections with people. So
and anarchy meaning no rulers, as opposed to like the sort of connotation we sometimes attach to it, which is like chaos.
Yeah.
And if you read like the original Relationship Anarchy Manifesto, it's a beautiful document.
It is,
about relationship design as opposed to like lack of design. But it's like we're choosing all elements of what you want the relationship to look like. And the word anarchy just like has a kind of stigma to it.
Yeah.
And the folks who haven't done their homework tend to be like, oh, I'm just a relationship anarchist, and that means I can do whatever I want, and I have like there's no consequences here.
Yeah. The unfortunate consequence of non-monogamy becoming more mainstream is that we also have more non-monogamous fuckboys now.
Well, I wanted to pick up on two things. One, this idea of risk and desire. Like, I think it was really important what you said about, giving it that space of like a settling in period. Because I think when we're talking about, like when we think about exploring desire and when we think about how we're bringing things into the magazine as well, it's this idea of like, well, sex isn't always necessarily a comfortable encounter. Like, in order to experience transformation, you have to go through periods perhaps of discomfort or change. Like, change fundamentally means we're going to maybe push some boundaries and then feel like, oh, not for me, or absolutely yes for me. And it's that sort of being okay and present for maybe a moment that I'm right now describing as discomfort, but maybe there's some better adjectives we can bring in here, just like transformation. Let's think of butterflies. I think that's really interesting. And then also one of the things that struck me when I was revisiting The Ethical Slut was also this idea of how they're talking about abundance and love. And it reminded me, for me, in terms of like decolonizing desire, one of the theorists that I've really loved is Dr. Kim Tallbear, who's an Indigenous professor, who talks a lot about like kinship structures and kind of opening up, like, there's very specific work about like, marriage, asserting in the 19th century, like the nuclear family as like a unit, as an agent of nation building, which I think is a whole other conversation. But to sort of keep it in the realm of The Ethical Slut, I think this idea of like the concern that the wife raises and the concerns that you've just raised that your clients sometimes have about who's going to take care of the kids and what is the relationship design going to be like. I think that's a part of this text that still feels like deeply relevant and very now. And I wonder, can we pick up on like non-monogamy today? Because I think in this book it's very much like this subject position of like, this is a manifesto, we're like breaking out into this new space. And in this edition they're already talking about how certain concepts are more updated and that they're new norms. And so I don't know, how much is a kind of an outsider position part of the appeal of non-monogamy for some people, do you think? And is this question too general? Or
Well, I love
as
a lot
it is
of,
mainstreaming, what
Yeah.
does it feel like within the communities, or maybe even in like a more
Yeah.
mainstream field space?
yeah, I love so much of what you're touching on. Like, monogamy has historical ties to agriculture and people as property and marriage as a construct of property.
Specifically women as property.
Women
as
as
well.
property, I should say. And we are still in this era living under capitalism. So again, it's like if the vacuum, it's not a vacuum, right? So you like have to account for how you sort of personally grapple with these larger political questions. And I think some people are more radical and like fully reject those things, and some people operate sort of code switching, like holding down a sort of presented life of monogamy while quietly being non-monogamous, maybe not out to like family or publicly. And I think all of it's kind of, I think that non-monogamy is at its best like tied pretty closely to all of those progressive agendas, to like the dismantling of patriarchy, the dismantling of capitalism, and considering different like community structures and the abundance of love, and that love isn't scarce. It's something that we can all have and possess and share as much as we want and feel. Time, however, money, like these are factors that childcare like come into play. And I think in writing this piece, I was looking at too, like the ways that women specifically who have accommodated these structures, it's almost like a Stockholm syndrome kind of thing, but like become the perpetuating energy of these systems, you know, without realizing they might be participating that way.
Because that's what the care structure that they're familiar with and comfortable with, and,
Exactly.
and how the language for
And that's
it
the
looks
power
like.
structure they've been handed. It's like, if you are going to be of value, if you're going to have any currency, if you're going to have safety and home and shelter, this is what you do. This is how you perform your identity. This is like how you operate. And a lot of these disruptive conversations are a person in, they can be a person in a position of privilege, like a breadwinning man, and a woman saying like, well, where does that put me? If we're not using this system, how do we account for like a new system? Is that actually going to support me or like exist? Yeah.
Is this something that like, how does this feel from like your perspective with your work?
Yeah, I think, so, you know, like, I don't identify as a woman, but I'm aware that I am perceived as such politically. And so that's a massive caveat. Like, but, you know, I speak with a lot of kind of women in my work, kind of, and also, you know, personally, professionally, etc., who I think enter into non-monogamy thinking that, oh, like, you know, people who practice non-monogamy are going to have all these progressive values, it's going to be a safer space, yada yada. And like, to some extent that is true. I think that, you know, like women get more autonomy sexually or romantically, you know, like not just being able to like discover like their sexuality and eroticism and try different things and like, you know, and embrace being a slut or, you know, whatever. But also on the other side, you know, yeah, as you said, we are still living under capitalism, we're still living under patriarchy, and those kind of forces kind of still kind of come through in really sneaky ways. And so I think in the context of, I think about this in the context of like infidelity or like when boundaries are broken. And often like if it's in a monogamous cheating situation, like especially if it's like the man cheating, like the partner, the woman will typically blame like the other women, you know, as a whole ass trope, rather than, you know, taking it up with their own partner. And I see this like in polyamorous dynamics as well. Like someone will be like, my metamor is your partner's partner. Like my partner's partner like, is such a bitch. She's so jealous. She's so controlling. You know, like my partner's cancelled on me like so much, like for the past couple weeks, and like I don't understand why she can't just let go. And I was like, well, but your partner also made a choice to cancel those dates. Like, you know, why are you blaming this other person? You know, when actually like the problem is with the person in the middle who's managing this. Or, you know, I'll see situations where like 2 women or 3 like will be desperately trying to like get like their shared male partner to like take some emotional responsibility for his actions, and it gets really frustrating. And so, yeah, like the emotional labor, you know, or like, you know, literal labor in the case of like childcare, like that is still like, you know, that like, yeah, like women may have entered the workforce, but like, you know, in other respects, we have, if anything, have like doubled the amount of work that we need to do. And so, yeah, like a really great book that I'm just throwing book recommendations around now, but there's another great book that I recommend is Fair Play, which has nothing to do with polyamory. But it's just a really great book about like how you know, a couple, no matter what your genders, like can help like equalize kind of the labor in the home, and like not just with like, you know, childcare and dishes and whatever, but also like planning, like, and like remembering birthdays and scheduling like social time with people and like managing social calendars. Like there's so much invisible work that is done as well, like, you know, in that is completely just unacknowledged. So yeah, like I agree, like I think the polyamorous community and a lot of texts and whatever can get very dogmatic sometimes and make a lot of big general statements that sound really good, but that I think when you get down to the details of it may not apply to every situation. And I think social media makes this worse as well, because, you know, obviously like you're supposed to do all these sound bites and stuff. As a content creator, I often
a 2-minute video, I'm always like, unless, and here's this other piece. Like I so struggle to keep
5 asterisks,
anything under 5 minutes, and then I'm still like, but this is why you work with a professional, because as often as someone comes in and they're like, it's 2 weeks in, they're a year in, and they haven't done homework, and it's a mess to clean up, as opposed to like laying groundwork, you know, and looking at where we're going before we go, you know. Yeah.
Good girl. I want to talk about that right now, because I feel like it's a really good moment for that. And then I think maybe let's take the temperature for questions, because I feel like if there are a lot of questions, let's make some more space for that, because this feels like a fun space for exchange. But yeah, I mean, I think like that line really strikes me. I mean, you and I had a lot of conversations about sort of the fundamental generosity of the position of the slut, like this sort of, you know, but also the communication, the scheduling, the mindfulness one brings to navigating these things, which really, in an ideal world, in all of our relationships and all of our dynamics, work, play, or otherwise, it would be well communicated, and there would be spaces where we could talk about, you know, what things look like, how they feel, and how to optimize them, right? And I think like what really moves me about that good girl line is that, I mean, it's funny as well, but it's also like there is so much labor that goes into good communication. I mean, I think like also from the, you know, this is one of the things that I really like that this piece makes visible in the pages of the magazine, is just kind of like what it takes to be able to actually go out and explore desire on your own terms. I don't know, thoughts?
I will say I don't like being called a good girl. So
Not everybody does.
Yeah, like so like I said, I was just like, oh, okay.
Like not for me.
Also
Yeah.
Marmite. Ethical Slut. Marmite.
Yeah,
Good
certainly.
girl,
Well,
Marmite.
exactly. That's the point, right? Like we all have our own preferences, and like those preferences and desires are often taken for granted in other spaces. Whereas in the polyamorous, the non-monogamous space, we're having those conversations. We're being very thorough about what do you want, what are you into, what are the boundaries, like what's okay. And I think the criticism from the outside is like, that sounds like a lot of work, and it's like, yeah, it is, but it's incredibly hot when you actually feel really safe in a container, when you feel really clear about what's okay and what's not okay, and when you're like understanding the psychology of why someone might want something. I reposted a tweet just this week that was like, the polyamorous, the workaholics of the heart, and I was like, yeah, which is also like why when people try to fix a relationship with polyamory, you shall not. Like that is not the route to take. Like, which sounds a little contradictory to what I said earlier, that like having conversations about non-monogamy is an opportunity to address a relationship and really look at it. But if a relationship is problematic, if you're not communicating, if you're not getting along, and you're like your sex life, your intimate life is stagnant, and you're like, oh, let's just throw some other people into the mix. It's similar to like trying to have a baby to fix.
I literally say this.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's like whether you're bringing in a baby or like a unicorn,
new partner,
yeah,
yes.
like don't
Yeah.
bring other people into your mess and make the mess worse.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
I think it speaks to how difficult these conversations are to have. You know, I think sex and shame still sit so much side by side in our culture, and like these conversations are difficult to have fundamentally, but it's also a muscle, and that goes back to this, I guess, idea of, I'm like super into this idea of risk at the moment, and like getting comfortable with discomfort in order to be able to facilitate kind of newness or like a refresh. You want to speak? Go for it.
So, I mean, I think I'm going to bring in a little bit of kind of my experience as an autistic person specifically. Something that I found very comforting about non-monogamy was the fact that there were no assumptions about how the relationship could go. I think I got really tied up in the one monogamous relationship I had like nearly a decade ago now. When, you know, like there were so many like rules that people took for granted, and I was just like, but why? And being able to ask those questions without people looking at you funny was, I think, really liberating to me. And also it meant that, yeah, like with no assumptions being made, then everyone is actually on the same page. You know, we talk a lot about like negotiating boundaries and agreements and whatever in non-monogamy, but like you should be doing it in monogamous relationships as well. Like, you know, are you aligned on like how you define cheating? You know, like not everyone is. Like, I think there are some things that most people would agree is cheating, but then there are some kind of more gray areas that like you need to be talking about with your partner. And yeah, so I think like just the flexibility that is offered in non-monogamy, like the freedom to like negotiate things, like, and that just being like standard practice, as opposed to kind of something you have to introduce as like a radical thing, like, you know, is really freeing to me and also comforting. Like you know what you said about like the container. I absolutely feel that, you know, like, because I guess like the closest analogy I'm trying to think of, like when I was trying to navigate a monogamous relationship and just tripping up on like, you know, all these rules that my partner had just assumed that I knew that I didn't know about, like, yeah, like it felt like someone was being like, get in this box, and I was like, but where's this box come from? Like, yeah.
Can you point to the box? Yeah.
I remember this rock star memoir that I read in high school, and one of the "it's not cheating if they have my name tattooed on their body" was one of their not cheating.
Wow.
It's not cheating.
I don't know that I've heard that one.
It's Marilyn Manson, but I feel like but yeah, it was the 90s. Audience, I would love to hear your questions. Who wants to raise their hand and join in on the conversation? Yay. Okay, how are we going to do this with the microphones? Can you project? Would you like to try, or would you like to come here?
I can project.
Wonderful.
How much do you say attachment style feeds into these dynamics? And do you need to be in a secure attachment style to sort of experiment?
So the question, just for the benefit of the rest of the audience, was like, how do attachment styles intersect with this kind of thing, and do you need to have a secure attachment style to practice this? And
I'm really curious for your answer on this.
I would say no.
Yeah.
And actually, like, just from just all the online discourse that I, for all my sins, participate in online, just like a lot of people stereotype polyamorous people as avoidantly attached, because there is this assumption that like, oh, if you have multiple partners, then you're just avoiding quality time with all of them. You're just kind of jumping from place to place. You can't commit, etc., etc. And that's like not the case. Like there are people who, you know, like have all kinds of attachment styles, who practice all kinds of, you know, relationships. And obviously, you know, like having a secure attachment means that, you know, you're probably going to navigate it with a bit more ease. But like, I think that it's also about, it's less about your attachment style, I think, and more about like how you process your emotions, like how you navigate through conflict, how good you are at like repairing, you know, from conflict, and like trying to understand like different people's perspectives. Because I think like depending on your attachment style, like it's very easy to project your own assumptions about what your partner is doing like onto them, or like to kind of not give them the benefit of the doubt, or like to do all kinds of things and have unhelpful thoughts that can lead to all kinds of miscommunications. But so I think I don't think your attachment style should be a barrier to practicing non-monogamy, but I do think that what you said around like foundational relational skills is probably more important, and those can be learned regardless of how much trauma you have or whatever. Like, what do you think?
I have a slightly controversial take on this, which is that especially with the internet and the way that like attachment theory has become a like therapy speak, like buzzwordy thing that we have sort of a surface level understanding of, generally speaking. Sometimes people, I think, treat attachment styles like astrology signs. Like,
yes,
I'm an avoidant, I'm an anxious, and I think attachment theory is wonderful because it gives us language around behaviors and it gives us understanding of why we're inclined a certain way. But a slim, and listen, the numbers are hard to pin down, but a slim majority of people are securely attached, whereas I think a lot of us look for the negative indicators and say like, oh, I'm anxious because I have any kind of anxious thought. So I always try to be careful about, like, as much as like polysecure and polywise are both so rooted in that, they're actually just like practical guides to navigating that, to like dealing with those challenges and saying like, if you're inclined this way, it might be an older wound and let's look at that. I actually think non-monogamy is a beautiful way to heal from attachment challenges.
Absolutely.
Like if you have an anxious inclination, it sort of forces you to confront that. And I often, and I'm not the only one to do this, but I really like to think of easing into non-monogamy as exposure therapy, that you are deliberately exposing yourself to challenging experiences, to discomfort within a sort of safe realm. You're not going from 0 to 60, you're not, and people often are, but you're not necessarily jumping right into the most advanced, so to speak, kind of polyamory, but rather like seeing what you're comfortable with and progressively opening up to certain activities, certain partners, like different ways of operating, like with an existing partner or with new partners if you're not already in a relationship, and then building comfort, building understanding through that sensation, like the same way you do with exposure therapy. And avoidance is a good way to stay pretty locked in anxieties, in that kind of patterning. So I think that the challenge of non-monogamy is actually a really beautiful instrument to navigate and to grow out of your attachment style if you are inclined a certain way.
Yeah, and to build on that as well, like apart from people being really prescriptive around attachment styles, like also like I mean I think attachment styles were born out of just like just in a monogamous paradigm, right? So like I think whoever came up with attachment theory probably didn't consider the idea of like having multiple partners, and how like for me, like when I've had like kind of different relationships going on, like I have different attachment styles for each partner. Like there are some people that I show up as more avoidant with, and some people I show up as more anxious, and some people I show up as more secure or whatever, because I think it's a dynamic that forms between you. Like like my anxious side is probably going to come out more if I'm dealing with someone who's more avoidant, right? Mm-hmm. And then you enter into that chase. But like if someone's not going to be doing that, then we're going to enable each other a bit less. So I think it's less about your own attachment style being fixed, but more about, I guess, what traits or what wounds other people bring out in you, which kind of relates to your point about how polyamory, non-monogamy can actually be a really great way to heal those wounds. Like, and it's more important to focus on the wounds and be aware of them and that kind of thing than to be like really prescriptive about like what that means for your attachment style. And I think perspective matters as well. Like for I've met people who like get really anxious about the idea of non-monogamy because like, oh my god, like I have separation anxiety, I get really if my partner's out on a date, like I'm scared they're gonna leave me. And then like I've met other people who are like, oh, it's actually like my anxiety absolutely melted away when I started practicing non-monogamy because I felt like I had so much less pressure on me to like do like be everything for my partner. And now that I know that they can get these needs met or like pursue these interests like elsewhere, like I can just be myself, and that's really calming. So like I think it's like reframing things can sometimes be really important.
I think this question of the dynamic is really, really interesting. I think that's a really wonderful point, as well as kind of like the sort of floppiness of language. Like I think there's this, like it's really easy to want to sort of grab language and take it for its meaning without sort of understanding that it is also sometimes just a conduit for ideas that need to be nuanced and deepened, because it feels really good to suddenly have language for something and to be able to articulate something, but that's not the end, and that's where the tension between, I think, theory and practice comes out so beautifully in your work. Do you wanna, should we invite another question?
Yeah.
I feel like, I mean, do we have like 10 minutes for questions? Is that just one?
Probably another 5.
Okay, great. Hi, more questions, please. Please, hands.
How do you deal with jealousy if it comes up? Do you ignore it?
No.
How do you deal with jealousy was the question.
Thank you for repeating the questions. You invite the monster into the room, right? It can be healing in the sense that it can sometimes illuminate something that you might actually want to address in a relationship. Like it can provide information about, like, is this a substantive, like, is this a meaningful feeling? Is it worth sharing this to see if there's something in this relationship that I want to navigate with my partner? It can also be, like, for me personally, and this is in my personal life as opposed to in my coaching, like, again, it's a growing experience. Like, I am a naturally competitive person. I am a naturally jealous person. And I think that's partially why I'm like, oh, non-monogamy is good for me, because I cannot exert control. So it ties actually directly back to that, like, exposure therapy feeling that, like, you do really just have to sit with the feelings and welcome them and examine what's there, but take that sort of mindfulness approach of, like, letting those thoughts exist without them defining you, and letting the jealousy exist without it being a predetermined narrative or, like, a foregone conclusion. And it can be really fascinating to, like, observe what the mind does. And when you really get at its core, it's quite often at its root a kind of insecurity and something that you might want to address independently of, like, why do I feel like I'm not worthy, or why do I feel like this person could just swoop in and blow up my relationship? Like, why do I feel like I'm not whoever I think I am in this way, you know? So yeah, it's I think it's kind of healthy. Like, we look at it as it should never exist when we think mononormativity. But I think in non-monogamy, it's kind of a given. Not everyone. Certainly there are some folks that, like, struggle with it a lot less than others, or don't really feel it as much. But for folks who are just starting to experiment, I'm like, absolutely accept it. I have a kind of philosophy about, like, all things in my life, and I learned this as, like, a theater producer, that, like, there will always be problems. And so when the problems come, you're like, here it is, rather than, like, I did something wrong or it's gonna be a disaster, but just like, oh, here it is, great, here it comes. So similarly, like, expecting jealousy, expecting challenging feelings, and just saying, like, that's just part of it. Like, this is part of the growth, and this is an opportunity to, like, look inward and also just make sure I feel well tended to, and all of the right elements in my relationship and the power dynamics, like, in place in a good way. And why am I jealous about this person as opposed to this person? Like, it really exposes a lot of things we take for granted.
I think that last point you made about, like, expecting it, and so you're not, like, completely bowled over when it happens, is a really great way to kind of prepare people for, because people are going into it being like, I need to be perfect at this, and it's like, no, you're gonna set yourselves up for failure. I'm part of the very kind of small percentage of the population, I think, that, like, doesn't really experience jealousy. Like, I mean, I started quite early on, and, you know, like, yeah, I think I've probably experienced kind of, like, jealousy that's, like, really kind of, like, affected me, like, maybe like 4, 5 times. But, like, when I'm working with clients, like, I kind of approach it from a variety of angles, like, because when jealousy is a very broad emotion, like, you know, like, jealousy can be caused by a very wide variety of things. It can be fear, like fear of abandonment. It can be, like, insecurity, you know, like fear of not being enough. It can be, like, grief over the relationship that you used to have. Like, it could be, like, fear of change. It could be a sense of betrayal, a sense of resentment, like literally like so many more besides. And so actually getting to the root of like, what do you mean when you say you're jealous? Like, what are the specific thoughts that are going through your mind? And, and then going from there, I think is going to be really useful. I would also kind of contest the idea that like jealousy is a monster. I actually like to think of it as a teacher, because, and also like not every instance of jealousy is like due to something going on with you. Like I think there is a lot of focus on like self-work and development and stuff in non-monogamy, and that's of course crucial and very useful. However, like sometimes you are jealous for very valid reasons. Like sometimes like if you know, it's one thing if like you think your partner is gonna leave you and then you get in a tizzy about that. But like if your partner is actually like withdrawing from you, spending less time with you, deprioritizing, of course you would feel jealous. So like I think if anyone's trying to tell you to like eliminate jealousy just from your emotional vocabulary, that's complete bullshit. Because there are sometimes instances where like your jealousy is trying to tell you something. So I try and separate it into like internal factors and external factors. Like, is this a wound? Is this something you're projecting from your past? Or is it like something that's like actually tangibly going on in your relationship that you should address with your partner, or like think about whether this relationship is even a good fit? Like, because sometimes you feel crazy because your partner's making you crazy, and I think like we do ourselves a disservice to kind of ignore that and make it out like we're the problem like all of the time.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think this is, I love the idea of jealousy as a teacher. I mean, but also jealousy as a monster, but just the idea of like encountering it.
Yeah, well,
in its forms.
When I mentioned the monster, like I'm thinking of the analogy of like shining a light and being like, oh, it's not so scary. Like, come on in. Like, what does it look like? What is this thing? Like, what is this creature? And if I hold it over here, I'll never understand it. Whereas if you invite it in and
I
hope
hope that shining a light is what we have done on this deep and complex topic.
Great summary.
I'm going to invite Lucy Rower to the stage to give us some closing remarks, but I would really like to say a huge thank you to Evan Underly, Senna Heslop, Laura Ramade, and Leanne Yao for being so wonderful. Lucy.
Yeah, I just want to thank you all for coming again, and I want you to stay. I want you to chat. We can chat to all of us. You can chat to each other. You can listen to music, buy drinks, and also buy issue 3, which is just over there. Then you can actually hold the essay in your very own hands, which is a completely different experience, and interact with it in a different way. We're also selling these amazing posters, A2, Studio Frith designed. You can buy them at the bar, and also to say that this is the first of a series of 3 on decolonizing desire, and you are so welcome to come to the next one, the next 2, the next one's on the 5th of June. I'm in conversation with Maxine Mei Feng Chung about legacy. We're exploring legacy through Jeremy O. Harris's Slave Play, and we've just heard that Malika, who was Kanisha's understudy in the West End version of the play, is going to join us as well and perform. So I think it's going to be amazing. The one on the 3rd of July is a wonderful evening of art and poetry and discussion led by Saskia again, with the poet and activist Lisa Minerva Lux exploring ideas beyond ownership. So please come, support us. It would be wonderful. The tickets are on Eventbrite. And also, there's 25% off annual subscriptions. Just find Michaela or one of the QR codes on the bar, and then you can just put in the code. And thank you so much for coming. It means a lot.
Right.